The inquest into the kidnapping and murders of the Cradock Four began in Gqeberha this week, with Fort Calata's son, Lukhanyo Calata, delivering emotional testimony on how the four anti-apartheid activists died. The Cradock Four, Matthew Goniwe, Fort Calata, Sparrow, Mkhonto and Sicelo Mhlauli, were abducted and murdered by South African security police in June of 1985. I'm now joined by Karyn Maughan, a News 24 journalist who's covering the inquest. Karyn, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. So you penned quite a comprehensive piece with News 24 about the Cradock Four in terms of where their journey began, especially with Calata and Goniwe, both educators who were actively seeking for equality in the country, leading the Cradock Residents Association, as well as then fleeing their homes from the apartheid government who wanted to silence their truth, and ultimately which led to their murders, the inquest that we've seen, and the current inquest that's currently taking place. Why do you think high-level accountability for the murders of activists such as Goniwe and Calata and the other two has remained elusive for so long?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing to remember about the murders of the Cradock Four, it is really one of the few instances, if not the only instance, where we have clear evidence in the form of a military signal, which was provided in 1992 by General Bantu Holomisa from what was called the State Security Council. Now, for viewers not familiar with what that was, it was a body that was created by the apartheid government in the 1970s to essentially oversee their security policy and the implementation of that policy. And at that time, during the State Security Council meetings, F.W. de Klerk was the Minister of Education. And as you rightly point out, both Goniwe and Calata were educators, they were teachers, and they were instrumentally involved in some of the most effective activism in the Eastern Cape area. And we know that as a consequence of that state security meeting, a military signal was sent out that these teachers and Goniwe's cousin, Mbulelo, needed to be, quote unquote, and I'm going to say it in the original Afrikaans, permanent van die samelewing verwyder word, which basically translates as must be permanently removed from the society. And of course, we know a few days later, they are brutally abducted during a police roadblock and then subsequently found murdered in terrible conditions, so bad that Calata's wife says she was never given the opportunity to identify his body. And it remains one of the great sources of pain in her life. And so, you know, there's this clear tracing line where we had this rhetoric from F.W. de Klerk in the TRC that, you know, the apartheid, he was shocked and appalled to hear about these extrajudicial killings. But simultaneously, we have this military signal, which very much reveals that the State Security Council were very aware of these teachers and had asked that they basically given a directive for them to be permanently removed from society in the days before their brutal murder. And I think that that is what's so pivotal to this inquest. It is now the third inquest. The first one didn't apportion any responsibility. The second one, which was done after that military signal emerged, found conclusively that the security police were responsible for this. And now this third inquest is will hopefully deliver on what Calata and Goniwe and the other Cradock Four's families are desperately hoping for. And that's high-level accountability about who were the people who ordered this murder.
And speaking about that accountability, I mean, we can't have this conversation without expanding on the responsibility of the new democratic South Africa and what efforts were made post-1994 with regards to holding people accountable. And you also speak about the roles of former officials like Vusi Pikoli as well as Menzi Simelane. Talk to us about what it is that they tried to do in trying to expose the alleged interference by the Mbeki administration.
I think that this is one of the great travesties of our democracy. And the tragic reality is that many South Africans, many Black South Africans will have at least some direct or indirect account of a family member that went missing. To this day, they don't know what happened to them. And, you know, that is the reality for many, many families in our country. And what was so tragic was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were many, many people who came to the TRC and gave evidence about killings and disappearances, but were not honest. And they were denied by amnesty by the TRC. And in 300 odd cases, the TRC said, we believe there should be investigation and there should potentially be prosecution at the discretion of the NPA, because obviously the NPA is an independent entity. But what happens is that that simply does not occur. And we now know from evidence that was given by Vusi Pikoli in litigation from as early as 2015 that he described what was an active campaign to suppress the prosecution of so-called TRC cases. And that includes the Cradock Four and many others. 22 of those families now have launched litigation in respect of that non-prosecution and the alleged political interference. And we now have the president instituting a commission of inquiry into that alleged interference, which the members of the Mbeki administration who have been implicated in it vehemently deny. But essentially what Pikoli and other senior prosecutors describe is attempted interference by, amongst other people, Jackie Selebi, who was at that stage the National Police Commissioner, Menzi Simelane, Bridget Mabandla, who was then the Justice Minister. All of those people have denied any, Jackie Selebi is obviously now late, but certainly from Bridget Mabandla's side and Thabo Mbeki's side, they have vehemently denied any wrongdoing.
Right.
But it is very clear that those cases were not prosecuted. And that's why this Kampepe Commission into the non-prosecution of these crimes is so pivotal. Because we are talking about people who gave their lives for this democracy. And when the democratic government came into power, they did nothing to uncover the truth of what had happened to them and how they had been murdered and killed. And, I think and Lukhanyo Calata has spoken very eloquently of that. And for many of the other families, that feels like the most deep and profound betrayal. And that's what this commission, this inquest, and these subsequent legal processes are all about redressing.
Well, we certainly do hope to get that redress in this third inquest. Thank you so much for your time.